When I was in school, I did literally no work for exams until the very last minute. Imagine you've got 7 days to go before an exam. You're behind in class, you haven't been learning properly or effectively, and then suddenly you're set with a lot of productivity guilt and you just can't focus to get that work done. As the exam looms, panic sets in and you need to cram everything into the last few days before your exam or you're going to fail. Now, I've been there and we've all been there, and while I don't condone cramming as an effective study technique, in fact all the evidence says it's one of the worst ways to learn possible, sometimes life gets in the way and you need to do a lot of focused learning in a short space of time. Now, luckily, I'm one of the masters of cramming for exams at the last minute. And so in today's video, I'm going to share with you some of my most effective evidence-based techniques for learning effectively in a very short space of time so that you can pass that exam and take out the stress from any last-minute revision. So hit that subscribe button and let's get into it. Now, I've broken up this video into 3 parts, and I'm really confident that if you follow these 3 key tips for cramming at the last minute, then you'll be able to pass your exams effectively. But before we get into those tips, I just want to emphasize that cramming is not a good way to deeply learn knowledge. The problem with cramming is it puts things into your short-term memory rather than allowing you to develop deep understanding of the topics that you're learning. Remember, exams test the application of knowledge, not just the memorization and repetition of facts. A lot of people, when they study, think they just need to learn the facts because that's what they worry about they'll get wrong when the exam comes around. But actually, most exams look at how you apply your knowledge. For example, in medicine, if you're doing a multiple choice written exam, the questions don't normally test your actual memorization skills by asking you for specific facts and details. Most of the time, these are short clinical cases where you have to use your knowledge to work out the best management options for a patient or the best treatment. When I was in my first year at medical school, I actually failed my first exam, which was a cardiology paper, because I did absolutely nothing during term time and then tried to learn everything the night before the exam. I literally stayed up till 4 in the morning revising the facts and figures around cardiology and then flunked out because when it came to the exam itself, I was so tired, none of the facts popped into my brain from my short-term memory and I just couldn't apply that knowledge effectively. So learn from my mistakes and let's get into my key 3 steps to cramming effectively before an exam. So tip number 1 to effectively cram before any exam applies equally whether you've got 2 days, 1 day, 7 days, or 3 months before the actual exam date. And it's all about how you choose to study. If you look around at your peers in the run-up to any exam, you'll probably see that a lot of them are still using techniques like rereading or highlighting or just reading back over their notes in the run-up to the exam. I remember when I was at medical school, if I looked around on the day of an exam, there were lots and lots of people who'd still be flicking through their notes, reading books, and kind of panicking even if they'd done a lot of revision throughout term time because they were paranoid they didn't know the facts. And this is a completely incorrect way to learn. As we know from Herman Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, while cramming is absolutely inferior to using skills like spaced repetition to really consolidate long-term learning of any material that you encounter, rereading or just highlighting notes is also significantly inferior to using techniques like active recall. If you've got a limited time, you need to use the most effective and efficient study techniques to learn as much content as you can in that limited time that you have. As a quick example of this, while I did fail a cardiology exam in my first year, I also crammed a couple of other exams at school and in my first and second year of med school before I learnt some of these evidence-based revision techniques. If you've got a limited amount of time before your exam to really learn new topics, diving in and using techniques like active recall and specifically using past paper questions and question banks that most realistically simulate the exam you'll be sitting is the most effective way to learn. Remember, your school, university or college setting the exam likely has their own bank of questions that they draw the real exam questions from. And so if you can complete as many active recall questions as possible in the time that you have, you're giving yourself the best chance of some of those questions coming up in the exam itself and you being able to increase your pattern recognition skills and get those questions right when it matters. Now, if we look at what the top 1% of students do in the run-up to their exams, it's very different from what the rest of students do. Most students tend to just read over things, while the top 1% are continuously doing active recall questions in the short amount of time that they have. This is pulling information out of their brains and forcing them to work hard to recall information and solidifying that knowledge. They're also practicing in the format of that final exam. If you think about a basketball player, they're going to be shooting hoops and practicing before a game. They're not sitting down and reading about the theory of basketball. They're actually practicing and getting it in their muscle memory. And that's exactly what your brain needs to be doing. It needs to be going through those exam questions in the same format as how they're going to be shown on the exam itself. That way, when they come up, you'll be much more familiar with the final way things are tested, and you'll be more likely to do well and select the correct answer when it matters. Whatever type of exam you're revising for, whether it's a multiple choice exam, whether it's an essay-based exam, or whether it's an oral exam for languages, actually practicing the skill that's going to be tested in the format that it's going to be tested on is the most effective way to learn in a short space of time. And this is because a lot of learning is around pattern recognition. If you can recognize patterns in how questions are asked in the final exam, or around certain topics that come up, or ways that knowledge is applied, then you're giving yourself the best chance to do well. But if you've got a really short amount of time, it's unlikely you're going to be able to cover the entire syllabus using active recall questions or going through every single component of past papers. And that's where tip number 2 comes in. So my next tip for cramming in a really short space of time and passing your exams is all about realizing that cramming is going to be a bit of a trade-off. You're going to have to focus on the high yield topics and take the big step of leaving some things out. If you think about the last time you revised for any exam, you'll know that around 80 to 90% of all the knowledge that you learnt for that exam actually isn't tested and doesn't come up. And this can be really frustrating. For example, when I had to revise for my trauma and orthopedic specialty training interviews, I ended up revising way too much orthopedic knowledge for the short 5-minute clinical interview where I got grilled on my clinical knowledge. I ended up revising things to a very intricate and deep level, and I knew loads and loads of facts and knowledge and application of that knowledge around trauma and orthopedic surgery. But I was only really asked about 3 clinical scenarios and how I would manage those. This was pretty frustrating, but it's also a great example of why revising the most high-yield topics is the most effective way to learn in a short space of time. If you can get hold of past papers or speak to people who've been through the exam that you've sat already, you can find out what comes up most often. Equally, if you dive into the syllabus, it might just show you what's going to be tested and how frequently and in what way. This allows you to then focus your exam preparation. The 80-20 rule of anything dictates that 20% of your input gives 80% of your output. And what this means is that if you can focus your preparation around things that come up most frequently using evidence-based techniques like active recall, you're going to be revising most efficiently in that limited time that you have. Now, the problem that most people have here is that people tend to revise in a comfortable ABCDE manner. They'll go through any particular chapter of a book and they'll read it from chapter 1 to chapter 10 in that specific order, regardless of what's high yield and regardless of what comes up most frequently at the exam. This is because we're taught to read in a logical, alphabetical or numerical way in order to cover all the information. We're not taught to jump around textbooks or jump around topics and focus down on the things that are most important. When we start worrying in the run-up to exams, our brains get super specific, overthinking about every possible thing that we could be tested on. And we think that we need to read every single sentence of every single textbook because those things might come up in the exam. And this is absolutely not true. Remember, the exams test your application of knowledge for the most part. And what you need to pick out are the things that are likely going to be tested, rather than trying to read and memorize every single specific sentence. A lot of the time in lectures or the notes that you take down from lectures, lecturers and teachers and tutors may well go off topic and cover things that interest them that actually aren't in the exam or aren't relevant at all to your revision. And so you need to cut out these and be absolutely savage at not revising certain things. Equally, if you have very limited time, you might have to make a big decision and just cut out whole chapters of books or of topics that are going to come up on the syllabus and just think, I'm going to chance it on that and I'm going to focus my revision on the very high yield topics. As an example of this, when I was revising for my respiratory exams, again in first year before I discovered some of these evidence-based revision techniques, I decided that with just 3 days left before the exam, I actually didn't have time to deeply learn and revise oncology and respiratory, and so I just left this out completely, because in the syllabus, it was only a small portion compared to the rest of respiratory disease, like things like asthma and COPD, which is where I focused my cramming. And this worked quite effectively, but it was a real gamble and it was pretty scary making the decision to just cut that out. But if you've got limited time, that might be something you need to do. This then nicely leads into tip number 3, which is all about backing yourself and managing your physiology and your emotions in the run-up to that final exam period. Now, one of the reasons I'm so obsessed with learning, and I've built some really successful edtech companies, is that in my opinion, exams are really for the benefit of those bodies setting the exams like universities or schools, rather than for the benefit of you, the learner. Learning should be fun and it should be easy, and a lot of the time, exams create needless stress when we already know topics pretty well. And they're quite arbitrary to move us to the next stage of our education or professional development. And so tip number 3 is really to put things in perspective and to remember to manage your emotions during exam times. If you have left things to the last minute, it's going to be really stressful. And that's why I don't advocate cramming as an effective study technique, not just because it's not as effective of using evidence-based techniques like spacing or pre-reading or learning throughout the year and using active recall. It actually increases your stress levels and it can make learning really horrible and scary. While the temptation might be there to stay up all night and to try and cram in as much information into your short-term memory as possible, this just isn't going to be effective. And worse, it's going to leave you sleep deprived, it's going to leave you probably pretty dehydrated and malnourished over a short space of time, and you're not going to be at your cognitive best when it comes to applying your knowledge. People tend to fret about the minute facts that they might be asked, when in actuality, exams are really about how you're going to use your brain to work out complex problems and apply that knowledge when it matters. And so you want to be at your peak fitness and be wide awake when they come round. For this reason, I'd aim to stop cramming and studying at a set time before your exam. I definitely wouldn't cram all the way through the night. And if you're in that situation, I'd highly suggest you put your books down, you close your laptop, and you try and go out for a run and then get some rest. In my opinion, it's much better to be alert and on form for the exam where you can work stuff out and back yourself with your own cognitive abilities than it is to try and pointlessly cram in lots and lots of facts into your brain which might not be tested and which might actually detract from your final exam performance. Instead, I'd suggest practicing some mindful exercises, getting a good night's sleep, having a bath or doing some exercise the morning of the exam, and actually stopping doing active recall questions about 3 hours before you get your head down onto your pillow, and certainly not trying to do anything on the day before the exam. Even if that feels helpful to you, it probably won't be when it matters. Now, I'm going to give a bonus 4th tip here that I think is really important if you want to get the most out of the limited amount of time you have before you have an exam. And so pulling all of these 3 tips together, tip 4 is all about creating a structured timetable in the final few hours that you have before an exam so that you get the most out of that time. This is basically a micro revision timetable where you sit down and you outline exactly how much time you have between now and when your exam is. If you have 7 days, if you have 5 days, if you have 2 days, or you just have a couple of hours, you can divide that time up between actually revising and doing other things. You can also use this as a way to build out a focused timetable around the high yield topics that you're going to focus on. You can break this down by hour or into Pomodoro style 20-minute revision sessions so you really blast through as many questions in the key topics that you want to cover in the time you've got. This element of actually managing your time effectively is really critical because it does 2 things. Firstly, it forces you to choose the topics that you're going to revise on. And secondly, it forces you to write down exactly what you're going to do, which then takes the stress out of actually doing it. If we have a plan laid out in front of us, it allows us to relax and not to procrastinate because we know what we need to work through, even if that time is short. And then we can focus all our attention on executing, doing the active recall questions on the high yield topics, and not getting too stressed out, even though the exam is just around the corner. In practical terms, if I just had 24 hours before an exam that I was sitting and I hadn't done any revision at all, what I'd do is I'd grab hold of some past papers or I'd get hold of the exam syllabus and I'd highlight things that I felt were high yield or I knew were going to be tested on the exam. I'd then force myself to select only 80% of that syllabus to work on, and I'd program that in to some of the past papers or to a question bank that I'd signed up to. I'd then split those topics into individual study sessions in the time that I had. And if I had too many topics, I'd just be savage and cut out the ones that weren't high yield or weren't as high yield as others, so that I was focusing on those questions most likely to be tested. I'd then open up my computer, get down to doing as many questions as possible, or if it's an oral exam, practicing with a friend or with a parent or whoever it is, and really just practice as much as you can. And finally, I'd also factor in some times for breaks and also my head to pillow time and my wind down routine time before the exam. I'd think about what I was going to do, maybe have a bath, maybe drink some tea, and maybe just have a nice relaxing time before the exam itself, so that I'm on form and I'm sharp, even though I'm cramming and I'm a little bit worried. Now, cramming is definitely not the best way to revise for exams, but don't worry if you're stuck in that situation. Remember, sometimes life does get in the way, and be kind to yourself and just try and do your best. Now, I hope you found this video useful. I've got some other great videos in the evidence-based learning series, including how to apply active recall in detail and how to revise for exams if you've got a little bit more time, which I'll put up here in the end cards. Thanks so much for watching and for subscribing. Do hit that subscribe button because I'm so excited to help everyone learn effectively and productively for exams this year. And I'll catch you again in the next video.